Bill and Bob today, and we're going to continue our discussion about Creedence Clearwater Revival, a band that the guys have been talking about album by album for a while, and it's at the point now where we're really at the 50th anniversary of the band's dissolution for all intents and purposes. Back in 1970, which is an interesting year as far as the band's kind of rise and fall they were well into their prime. And Bob's going to talk about a couple of artifacts from that period that really are resonant and very up to date, because if you are even a casual fan or a casual rock and roll aficionado, you may have seen that there was a Netflix documentary on the band and their tour of Europe in 1970, and an accompanying live album from that tour at the Albert Hall in London, and very importantly, a book that covers the band's history called A Song for Everyone that's been recently published. And Bob is our literary guru, and he has been studying the book as well as the other material that's come out. And we're going to turn it over to Bob and get his take on what's been recently released. Bob, what do you think?
All right, thanks, Bill. So, since we're talking about Creedence today, I want it to be noted that I am wearing my John Fogerty commemorative flannel shirt. Okay, so it was 50 years ago that the end of Creedence came about by a visit from band leader John Fogerty to bassist Stu Cook's house. Fogerty stood on Stu Cook's front porch and said, essentially, "I think it's over." And Stu Cook said, "Yeah, you're right, it is." And that was the end of one of the more successful American bands of the 60s and 70s. And now here we are 50 years later, and suddenly the fall of 2022, things have suddenly become all Creedence. And we had three significant things come about for that 50th anniversary of the dissolution of the band. First was a documentary on Netflix called Traveling Band, Creedence Clearwater Revival at the Royal Albert Hall. That documentary came out at the same time that a new album was released, which was a live recording from that performance in 1970 at the Royal Albert Hall. Also coming out this year was a new book that chronicled the history of the band. And I want to talk about those three things briefly today to kind of let you know what I think about them and what the content is in there. Now, if you're a real serious Creedence person, you probably already watched the documentary, heard the music, and maybe even read the book. So if you haven't, if you're a more casual person, this is really going to be for you, to let you know kind of what's in here. So I want to start with the documentary. Now, this documentary is not a warts and all presentation. It's more of a celebratory history of the band. Interestingly, it's narrated by actor and musician Jeff Bridges, who in his cult movie classic, The Big Lebowski, Creedence played, their music kind of played a key role in the plot of the movie. Bridges is a fan of Creedence, and that comes across, in the documentary. And separately in an interview, he acknowledged, how much he liked Creedence for their music. The documentary traces the early growth of the band. It has some footage from some of their very early performances. So it traces that history of them, growing up together in California, forming their band, and it documents that. And then it takes us to 1970 to their first European tour. And we get a lot of movie footage of the band going through Europe, sightseeing, some of their performances, things like that. It also features some contemporary interviews with members of the band. The last half of the documentary is concert footage from their April 1970 performance at the Royal Albert Hall. Now, what's kind of significant about this is that the band performed at Royal Albert Hall just days after it was formally announced that the Beatles had broken up and were done as a band. In fact, there's some footage in the documentary of the media coverage of that disillusionment, and it was almost like, oh my God, the British Empire has has fallen because of the Beatles. Bridges makes a claim that CCR was poised to be the next Beatles, that, you know, they could have become the preeminent rock band for the world like the Beatles. I think that's a little bit of a stretch. CCR was certainly popular. By the end of 1970, they had sold $100 million worth of records and tapes. In 1969, they actually outsold the Beatles. But to put them that high up in the spectrum, I think, is a little bit of a stretch. I love CCR's music. You know, they did some great material, but they never really evolved much as a band. There were a few exceptions here and there, but, you know, they found a format and they stuck with it. Unlike the Beatles, who started out as a pop group and then evolved into Sgt. Pepper's and all the other things they did, you know, before they ended as a band. So I think that's a little bit of a stretch. Like I say, it's a celebratory documentary. It doesn't touch on the controversies in the band, the inner tensions, the dictatorial leadership style, you know, that Fogerty had. There's also a little bit of a thing in the documentary that is a little misleading. You know, the performance at Royal Albert Hall was hailed as a success, and Bridges narrates that the band had like a 15-minute standing ovation from the crowd. That's actually misleading. What that was the crowd, an angry crowd demanding that the band come back out for an encore. And at this point in their career, the band did not do encores. And according to the book that I read, encores were a really big deal at the Royal Albert Hall. It was a tradition, and the crowd was demanding, you know, an encore. And Creedence is ensconced in their dressing room, refusing to come back out. And what isn't said in the documentary is that in the audience that night was Eric Clapton, Paul McCartney, and George Harrison. And they wanted to come backstage and see the band, but they couldn't get back there because of the angry crowd. So that's a little disingenuous. It's still an interesting documentary. There's some footage that, you know, we've never seen before. The concert footage from the Royal Albert Hall was lost in a vault for something like 50 years. You know, it's been cleaned up and is presented. So it's an interesting documentary. It's worth watching, but I just wanted to cover those two little points that I think are kind of disingenuous there, you know, about the claim that, you know, Creedence could become so preeminent, and the little thing about the audience reaction at Royal Albert Hall. So accompanying this documentary is the release of a live album of that Royal Albert Hall concert. There are 12 tracks on this this live release, running for about 42 minutes. It's digitally been restored and produced very well. It's a good recording. I would not personally call it one of CCR's best performances. It's been hailed, you know, as, oh my God, we've you know, discovered this. If you are a serious CCR fan, you'll probably want to put this in your collection for its historical significance. If you're a more casual listener, check it out on streaming. I wouldn't necessarily say you need to go out and buy it. It's really more of a greatest hits package, you know, from CCR. You're not going to hear anything new or different here. Some of the songs may be, you know, played a little faster. There may be a, you know, little bit of a guitar solo here and there, but it's standard Creedence material. And the one thing about Creedence is they were a workmanlike band. They came on stage, they did their music, and that's it. You know, they weren't into long, drawn out jam sessions. They didn't interact with their audiences a whole bunch. It was very businesslike, very professional, very presented. So if you want a live performance, you might do better to check out the recently, I think the newly released last year Woodstock performances. You know, Fogerty ironically didn't think they did that good a job at Woodstock. I think it's a better recording than the Royal Albert Hall. Part of the hoopla around this is that these Royal Albert Hall recordings were thought to be lost. And like I say, they were just recently discovered, digitally remastered, and now they've been repackaged. The other interesting little thing about this is that back in 1980, Fantasy Records, trying to capitalize on CCR, released a live album that was billed as being from the Royal Albert Hall. After it was released, it was discovered that it wasn't a Royal Albert Hall concert. It was actually from a concert that they did in the Oakland Coliseum in Oakland, California. So it was pulled, re-released, simply titled The Concert. So ironically, here we are, these 40 some odd years later, now we've got a Royal Albert Hall package out. So like I say, it sounds good. It's a good presentation. It's nothing new. You're not going to glean anything new from listening to this recording that you really haven't heard before. And for the most part, Creedence Live doesn't really differ that much from how they were on album and out of the studio. This was a band that worked very, very hard at making things as perfect as it could be. They would go into their, what they called the factory, where they did all the rehearsals, and they would nail all of their songs down before they went into the recording studio. So they were in and out of the studio pretty quick. And when they did their shows, as I said earlier, there wasn't a lot of banter with the audience. And in fact, according to the book, early on in their careers, Fogerty really didn't even look at the audience a lot when he was singing and performing. He would look usually at maybe like Doug Clifford, the drummer. And it wasn't until later on that he actually started kind of turning and facing the audience. So there's not a lot of interaction. It's, here's the music, we're going to do it, bang, we're done, see ya. So that's what you're going to hear from this recording. Okay. Now, the place where I learned the most about Creedence and got a new understanding of the band and who they are and what they did was from the recently released book called A Song for Everyone, The Story of Creedence Clearwater Revival, written by author John Lingen. And the author did 10 hours of separate interviews with Doug Clifford, the drummer, and Stu Cook, the bassist, 10 hours with each one of them. He interviewed people who knew the four Creedence band members when they were in high school. He interviewed contemporary musicians with them. He extended many offers for John Fogerty to do interviews. Fogerty turned him down. So the author relied on Fogerty's own memoir and then interviews that he had given across the space of time, for Fogerty's part of this book. The book paints a more nuanced picture of the band and gave me a little bit different perspective of who Fogerty was and the roles that the other members of the band played. And to recap, this was a quartet. John Fogerty on lead guitar and vocals, the songwriter, producer, director, manager, wore many, many hats. His brother, Tom Fogerty, on rhythm guitar, Stu Cook on bass, and Doug Clifford on drums. These guys grew up knowing each other. They met in high school. They started playing together in high school. And the book traces their early history, the time that they spent, in the San Francisco Bay Area. It delves into them trying to make a success as a band. Then, of course, it documents, their successes, how everything started falling apart. And there were some interesting factoids that came out of this book, that I'd kind of like to share with you. And some of it has some new insight into Fogerty and how he ran this group. And here's one example. They're in the studio recording the song Proud Mary. They decide to break for dinner. Fogerty tells the other three band members, hey, go to the restaurant. I'll hook up with you in a little bit. About 45 minutes later, he shows up at the restaurant, sits down, and tells them, I didn't like your backing vocals on Proud Mary. So I did backing vocals myself. I put my own voice there as the backing vocals. And from here on out, I will do all the backing vocals on a recording. The only time that any of you will do backing vocals is when we're live on stage. That's it, end of story. That was his management style. He just told them this is what's going to happen. It was really a slap in the face to his brother Tom, because Tom was an accomplished singer, and he was originally the vocalist, in the early days of putting the group together. And so like I say, from then on, the backing vocals you hear on all the albums, it's John Fogerty doing everything. One thing I also thought was interesting is that the band felt very frustrated throughout their career because they felt they weren't taken seriously, despite being hugely successful, selling, platinum, gold albums after gold albums, $100 million in record sales. They felt they weren't taken seriously by their peers and by a lot of members of the music press and the critics. And, they grumbled, we have all of this success, yet we're not taken seriously. They were called Boy Scouts, by their peers in the San Francisco music scene, largely because of their work ethic and because they had a no drugs, no alcohol policy when performing. They were sober on stage. And the book recounts how, like, the Grateful Dead was always trying to sneak LSD into the band. And so they had to guard against this. And there's one moment where Doug Clifford unknowingly got a cup of coffee from an urn that was laced with LSD by the Grateful Dead. And he recounts how that show that night, he played the entire set, biting the inside of his mouth so the pain would keep him grounded and, not to let him get carried away by this. So they were called Boy Scouts for that. It recounts how that, and they were kind of joked about, and made fun of by their peers because of that, work ethic. Also, they felt very slighted by the music press, who said, oh yeah, they're a great band, but, so that came out in the book. Also, I mentioned earlier about not doing the encore at the Royal Albert Hall. In August of 1969, at the end of a show, Fogerty just said, we're not doing encores anymore. And he said, they're fake, they don't mean anything, we're not doing them. And so when they go back to the dressing room after that, and he tells the band, we're not going back out for an encore, Doug Clifford flipped out, and started throwing tables and stuff around in there, like, we have to do this. This is expected. Yeah, Fogerty's right. The encores are kind of a game. We all know that, okay, you're going to leave the stage. We'll clap a little bit and you'll come back out. Fogerty didn't want to play that game. So from August 1969 on, no encores. They would have however many songs in their set. They would do the songs, good night, we're done, and they're gone. And like I say, that culminated there with the Royal Albert Hall, where that audience didn't give in. They took, they were demanding an encore that they never got. So, but that was another thing of Fogerty's dictatorial style. It's well known about the financial issues that plagued this band, and the onerous contract they got into with Saul Zaentz and Fantasy Records, how so much of their money disappeared. That was all Fogerty. He made the management decisions. He initially thought Saul Zaentz was a great guy, so he agreed to the contracts. He agreed, to putting their money in these offshore, Cayman Islands accounts and stuff. So that all is Fogerty. So not only was he, dictating how the music was going to go, he made all their management decisions. So that was something that I was not really aware of prior to getting into the book. I also got a little bit different perspective about the other three members of the band. And here's one little incident that I think is very, very telling. As I said, they were all together in high school. Tom Fogerty was a few years older than everybody else, but they all went to the same school and they grew up knowing each other. Doug Clifford, Tom, and John Fogerty came from poorer families. Stu Cook came from a well-off family. His dad was an attorney and such. And after they're out of high school, John Fogerty's working at a gas station. Tom Fogerty's married with a family, working for Pacific Gas and Electric. Stu and Doug went off to college. So they're doing their band thing part-time with the dream of, we want this to be our career. Tom Fogerty called a band meeting at one point and said, we're never going to have a music career if we try to do this part-time. So he made up an offer. He offered to quit his job, throw in his life savings, which is about $1,250 some odd dollars, and said the band can live off of that and we will try to do this full time. Stu Cook who had a fairly new car that his parents had given him as a graduation gift, sold his car and threw that money in. So from the contributions of these two guys, the band lived on that money, paid themselves like a $20 a week salary, and devoted themselves full time to trying to become a successful musical group. So I think that kind of shows the commitment and what these guys did to help make this band a reality. I've never had heard that story before, and it's something you don't hear Fogerty ever claim, because he's usually down pretty bad on his bandmates. Another telling story is Tom Fogerty eventually left the band in 1971, and they became a trio. And the guys were pretty upset about Tom Fogerty leaving. And later in the late 80s, Tom Fogerty contracted AIDS from a blood transfusion. He's in the hospital in 1990, dying. The only person who came to see him was Doug Clifford. The book says that Tom wanted to play music one more time, with his brother John. And John refused to come and see him in the hospital because John held a grudge, because in a lawsuit against Fantasy and Saul Zaentz, he didn't feel that Tom had really backed him the way he should. So really kind of a sad end, to the band, and how bitter things were that, John wouldn't even come and see his own brother on his deathbed. There was another side to the band also that came out, though. They were pretty altruistic. The book documents many times that they did benefit concerts, and it documents an incident from a group called AIM, the American Indian Movement. And at one point, they had occupied Alcatraz Island in a protest against the federal government, claiming that that really should be Indian land. Well, there was a boat that ferried supplies out to the AIM members who were occupying the island. Federal agents confiscated the boat. So Creedence pulled $10,000 out of band money and bought a boat for supplies to be taken out, to the Native Americans out there. It also documents how Creedence came out and supported a strike from workers at one of the FM radio stations in San Francisco. And then when things started kind of falling apart, the very last album Creedence did, Mardi Gras, the band members had been advocating that they wanted to have more input into the music. And that was why Tom Fogerty had left. So John Fogerty, they're in a limousine traveling, and Fogerty suddenly tells Doug Clifford and Stu Cook, for the next album, you each are going to be responsible for 1/3 of the contents. It's going to be 9 songs. You're each responsible for writing, performing 3 songs. And that was what happened. And Doug Clifford and Stu Cook, recount that we never said or felt we could replace John Fogerty. We didn't have his talent. We didn't have his natural singing ability. We just wanted to be able to have more say in how the band was going. And that was Fogerty's way of, okay, fine, then I'm going to dump this on you. And that was the last album they did. And then, like I say, it ended with John Fogerty going to Stu Cook's house, standing on the front porch and saying, I think we've come to the end. So the book had a lot of great revelations, gave me a different understanding of the band, some of the internal, external forces in there, what motivated them, and pretty interesting. So anyway, that's my recap of the 3 things that have come out this year, all part of the 50th anniversary of the end of a very, very, very successful band that in a short amount of time released a lot of material, sold a lot of records, and filled a lot of concert halls. Kind of sad that all of that incredible talent didn't last longer than those few years. John Fogerty is a very complex individual, a man really driven by what I perceive to be a lot of inner demons. I think a lot of insecurities, a guy who was very, very talented, but not necessarily really good on his people skills. Anyway, I thought it was a pretty fascinating look. I had read John Fogerty's autobiography. I think this new book helps balance that out because we get some other perspectives into Creedence. Like I say, the documentary, it's fun to watch. listen to the Royal Albert Hall recording if you're curious. But unless you're a diehard fan, you really don't need that recording in your collection. So, Bill, that's my take.
Well, thanks, Bob. I mean, I do have to say, I thought myself, as a longtime Creedence fan, that I understood the band. But of course, what became clear to me over the course of this time is that I knew them as a singles band, but I thought, flipping through all of the albums physically, just looking at them, that I had a handle on the band. I didn't. And so I listened to their discography, and I realized this was a fantastic band. And far, far better than I thought. And seeing the Albert Hall documentary was quite revealing to me, because I could see they were a good rock and roll band. As a live band, they were great. And you could see, I think, as you mentioned, they had been together for so long. You could see that they never quite adapted to the notion of what the late 60s and 70s were about when it came to rock and roll performance. They really were like the guys who did, where they would have a show with 5 or 6 performers. You go in, you do your stuff, and you get off. And interacting with the audience is a waste of time and energy. No need. My suggestion has always been, because I don't like encores either, that whole kind of kabuki theater of the encore. I would prefer, and since Fogerty never does that kind of interaction, it would be better to say, we're not going to do an encore, but we are going to do 2 more songs, and let's consider these the encore, and then leave. And that way the fans aren't disappointed, or at least they understand that you're not coming back. I think, what was also interesting is to realize that without John, the band would not exist. But John was like the worst possible person to be running everything other than singing and songwriting. Obviously, as he said, his people skills were suboptimal, to say the least. I mean, if I were in the band, I would have left probably day 3, because I don't think it'd be very easy to manage this. And the one thing, I mean, it's almost like they needed a Colonel Tom Parker in reverse. They needed somebody to slow them down. I mean, a band that put out, because I was reading these numbers here, the 4 platinum albums in the span of 16 months, and double-sided hit after double-sided hit is just exhausting your material so quickly that nobody can sustain that level of talent and quality for that long. And they did. I mean, that, which is the astonishing thing. I mean, attribute obviously to John Fogerty's raw talent. And you could see why the hippies down in San Francisco would find them to be a little bit odd, because of their more or less straight-laced approach. And maybe because of the top 40 nature of a lot of the hits, that kind of was counter to the whole notion of, first of all, don't put singles on your albums, and secondly, singles not a big thing anyway. You should be focusing on the album as a whole. Well, they did both. I mean, their albums were chock full of stuff that never got released and that I had never heard, even though I thought I understood the band. So this has been a real eye-opener for me. I think I have not read the book, but I did read the opening intro, which actually is quite interesting, because it ties right into the documentary period. So it's where they are first landing in London, and kind of looking around. And as you mentioned, just days after McCartney is indicated he's leaving and the Beatles are breaking up. So I had to rejigger the conceptual thoughts. Every so often I play around with, who are my personal best 5 American rock and roll bands. And I like the Beach Boys, the Ramones, the Velvet Underground, the Talking Heads, I got to put Creedence up there in the top 5. And if anybody is like me, who pretends that they understand this band and they haven't listened to the whole discography, you got to go back and do it, because you are going to have to change some of your thinking about this outfit.
Very, very, very good points, Bill, and especially the one about it almost being like a 50s rock and roll show. I had not thought of that analogy. But yeah, it is. And that's exactly the kind of workmanlike attitude they took. And there's another section in the book like I said, the band mirrored your thing. We've done all this fantastic stuff, but we don't get taken seriously. And there's a reaction in here from Fogarty where this one review where the journalist wrote about, oh, they're a great band and they do this and they do that, but it's like the band of the guys that you knew in high school. And Fogarty responded to it, said, gee, they tell me I sing like Mick Jagger, but I can't get taken seriously. So yeah, and you're right. Their discography is very, very solid. And when the band broke up, Fantasy was trying to capitalize on them as much as they could. So they packaged a Live in Europe album, which you need to avoid because that was their second European tour when they were a trio. And then Fantasy put out this greatest hits package called Chronicles, and they followed it up with Chronicles 2. They were both huge selling albums, but it packaged all of their hits. So you're right, a lot of their deep discography has been kind of ignored. And while I think they needed to do a little bit more evolution, they have a great discography. You're right, and they need to be taken far more seriously than they were, even though they were very, very successful. So, some good points there, Bill. Thank you.
Well, very good. Thanks, Bob. We've got some homework for you folks out there. If you want to spend some time with Creedence, you'll be well rewarded. And anyway, we've got more interesting stuff coming down the pipe. So stay tuned, subscribe, and tell us what you think in the comments. We'll see you soon.
Take care.
Do you feel that the group is going in the direction that you want it to go?
Yes, but just not fast enough.